Awesome, thank you very much. Yeah, if people do want to ask questions as we go, that's fine. I can normally deal with that, okay? But we'll see how we go. All right, hope people can see my screen as well. So yes, as was said at the top, I am going to talk about product development with SRE, but I thought I would just kind of start off with what SRE is, what it isn't, what myths there are around it, what anti-patterns I've generally seen in kind of enterprise SRE adoption mostly, because that's what I've been subject to for a number of years now. So we'll start with this part one of getting started with SRE. I think it's almost one of the main things about SRE is it's not one size fits all. Obviously, it came out of Google with the site reliability engineering book, and Google still holds a very strong kind of thought leadership position in SRE. But when Google told the world what SRE was, that was how SRE worked for them. And it's not quite as simple as just copying what Google does. A lot of people have tried to do that and found that it doesn't really work. And there are cultural considerations and different things you have to take into account. The second is that SRE is fundamentally different to traditional operations. Now, I have worked in traditional operations many years ago, and something I've seen a lot, which is unfortunate, let's say, is that quite often businesses go, oh, we're doing SRE, and all they've really done is rename the operations team SRE and gone, cool, we're doing SRE, we're doing the buzzword, we're doing the thing, which is not really what you want. And the third is when you're dealing with systems, failure is inevitable. Systems are going to fail. Even the systems that Amazon and Microsoft and Google run, they fail. They're not infallible, but that's okay. And really, a lot of this is getting to grips with the fact that failure is inevitable. It's how you deal with it and how you learn from it that builds your SRE practice out, if that makes sense. And hopefully it'll make more sense as I kind of go along. So Tyler already introed me very, very well, but just quickly to recap. So I work at Contino. Contino is a digital transformation consultancy focused mostly on regulated enterprises. So generally, I work with the slowest moving, biggest companies in the world and trying to get them to do things the way that we'd like them to, which, you know, can be quite difficult. As I said, I am currently almost finished writing the Cloud Native Security Cookbook with O'Reilly. I'm a HashiCorp ambassador. I'm an Amazon Partner Network ambassador. I do a lot of serverless development. I get around, I think, is probably one way of looking at it. I've been a consultant for the last Josh, 5 years now, and that's really...
Hi, Josh. Sorry, I'm cutting you off, but yes. Your screen is a bit cut off again on the side, so it's not fully visible again.
Oh, is it?
Yes. So sorry to cut.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me... No, that's fine.
Yes, now it's looking fine.
Yeah, what is it doing? Now it's looking fine, even though, okay, I've got the Zoom overlay over the top. Okay, we'll leave it like that, and then, yeah, please do tell me if it starts to go silly again. I don't know why it's doing that. Oh, yeah, people had say. Okay, cool. Hopefully people can see the slides. Okay, please do let me know if they do go again. I mean, hopefully it's more listening to me than reading the slides anyway. So hopefully it's not too bad. All right. So we'll jump into a few SRE myths. I kind of already alluded to them at the start. There's only one way to do SRE, and what someone tells you is this is SRE is what it is. No, not really. It's very evolving practice. It's not that old. People are still figuring it out, and really is a contextual thing about how it works for your organization and what your organization is actually trying to get out of it, because there's different outcomes you can be kind of drive. The second, it's not rebranded operations, and really the goal is not no outages. That's never a goal. That's an impossible goal. Please don't try and make that a goal, because it makes it worse. It's actually quite toxic to go for 100% reliability in systems, because you can't do it and you end up hurting yourself trying to. So really what it is there's many models of SRE, and I'm going to go into a few of them. SRE requires a different mindset. So I'll kind of go into how SRE functions, where it came from, and how you need to think about things a little bit, because that's kind of important in all of this, in learning the mental models and the way that Google arrived at this and the problems they were trying to solve. Because quite often people they have a solution looking for a problem. They're trying to do SRE when there's kind of more fundamental things they should be doing to get better outcomes for the business and stuff like that. And last, again, failure is inevitable. I'll go into that in quite a bit more depth and how you kind of manage risk and look at that. And when we drive into the using SRE to drive product development bit, hopefully that will come to the fore with that, because that's a big thing with this. So models of SRE. Before I talk about that, I just want to talk about team topologies a little bit, because I think this really kind of starts to talk to different kinds of models of SRE. And I think this is a really core part of understanding how an organization, I'm not going to say works, I'm going to say should work. So this was a book that came out, I want to say 2017, I might be wrong on the year exactly, but based on a bunch of research from enterprises looking at how do they structure themselves, what kind of teams do they have, and how does that enable them to move really quickly and do amazing things. And effectively it broke down every organization, every team within an organization, within the engineering function, should be one of 4 types. Stream aligned, which is you're delivering business value, enabling, where you're looking to help other teams, complicated subsystem, where you're looking after something that's really complicated, maybe DBA is looking after an Oracle database or something like that, something that you can't expect everyone to really understand, and most people don't need to understand. And then you've got platform teams. So in a cloud sense, the people who operate AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, or maybe the people that operate the large Kubernetes cluster that you're deploying applications onto, that kind of thing, they're providing some platform for other people to consume. And from there, you end up with 3 different interaction modes, which again, I think is super important for this. I do recommend that everyone go read this book. It is amazing, but you can have collaboration, which is 2 teams working really closely together. It makes a lot of sense in certain scenarios, which is you're trying to figure out something new together, or you're trying to define a shared interface or something like that. But it's really expensive because it involves a lot of the teams talking to each other. Then you get to anything as a service. And this is where you've got patterns and stuff like that you want people to be able to consume, and people can just take it. So now there's no handover having to happen between the teams, which allows teams to move a lot quicker. And then you've got facilitating, which is one team trying to upskill and enable another team to be able to do something. It's like a short-term kind of helping them be able to adopt a new practice or process or tool or something like that. So if you can kind of keep those in mind as I start talking through different kinds of SRE teams. And really SRE falls into one of these 4 team types. You can either have an enabling focus on SRE or a platform focus on SRE. And they're kind of 2 different flavors of trying to do site reliability engineering. Are the slides still moving for everyone? I did just see someone in the chat say that it's not moving, potentially. I'm going to assume we're fine. And then if other people can speak up or put in the chat if they're having issues with the slides as well. I do apologize. Okay, so with platform teams and enabling teams, you end up with kind of 3 different kinds of SRE of each. You've got kitchen sink, which is generally how people can kind of get started. They stand up an SRE team who are trying to figure out how it is they're going to work. They're trying to figure out what they're going to do. It's still in the very nascent stage, and they're just trying to do a bit of everything, and they're kind of working between teams trying to figure out how things are going. You've got infrastructure, which is normally SRE as a platform team providing like a Kubernetes environment or something like that, some kind of platform for people to consume. Then you've got products and application where you have a dedicated SRE team for some critical application. So say you have some business application, still showing earlier slide. Okay, let me stop and reshare. Maybe that will play nicer.
Yes, I was going to suggest that.
Yeah. Can people see a slide? Sorry, can people see a slide now with platform
right?
enabling and then 3 things underneath? Sorry?
Yes. Yes. That is the third slide, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Let me open chat again. Still a bit cut off. I hate technology.
Maybe you can try scrolling a little once you open the slides, and then we can check on.
Yeah. How about that? Is there any look on that as slides, or is that cut off a bit again?
This looks good. The third slide,
Looks good.
It's full screen.
Yeah.
Yep. You can try scrolling to check on the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So hopefully people can still see slides moving slightly now. I do.
Yes.
Technology is just the worst anyway.
I know.
So, you know, product and application teams. It's a new Mac I only got a few weeks ago, so I'm still kind of working out the kinks a little bit anyway. Products application teams, we have a critical business application. You actually have a dedicated SRE team looking to operating that application because it's critical. That's probably the style that's most close to traditional operations, and it's generally not a good idea in my experience, because it stops you from learning across the organization and you end up with silos. So you kind of go backwards away from DevOps. On the enabling side, you have embedded, which is where an SRE team will embed SRE team members and other teams to help drive SRE practice through the teams. Tools, where you're building bespoke tooling to support other teams. I'd argue that to a degree, Google's initial SRE did this kind of thing with Borg and where all that came from. And then you've got consulting, where you have short-lived engagements of the SRE team with another team where they try and upskill, but they don't, it's shorter term, they don't really get involved. If you've come across one of these or you want to learn more, the slides will be available after. There is a link here which goes into a lot more depth. That could be 45 minutes by itself, never mind the rest of what I want to talk about. Really, when you get down to it, the difference between platform and enabling is how you scale. Are you trying to scale through technology, or are you trying to scale through upskilling? Are you trying to use technology to make things easier for people, or are you trying to make people understand more so they can do more? I hate the fact that it's an or in the middle here. It should be an and, really, in my mind. And what I've seen be effective, and again, your mileage may vary on this, but something combined of infrastructure and embedded. So you want to build a platform, you want to build some standardization for people to consume. You probably also want to be able to embed specialists into team to do rapid upskilling and to help the team and live with the team as well and get you that really tight feedback loop. So when you've got an SRE team member embedded in a delivery team that are consuming the infrastructure from the delivery team's perspective, you can have some really good conversations and use that to drive the platform and the infrastructure you're building. I do think this is, I'm not going to say optimal. It comes with trade-offs. All of a sudden, it gets quite hard to prioritize where people are best spent and to grow that out. But when I've worked on teams that have operated in this style, it generally works really well, because you're giving yourself the option to scale both ways as what makes sense at the time. And you can kind of sprint by sprint, quarter by quarter, decide where your priorities are going based on what you're learning as you're going along, and you're not kind of reined into one thing. Okay, talk a bit of mindset now. who's responsible for the reliability of a system when you have an SRE team? When you have delivery teams that are building software, and then you've got site reliability teams, who owns reliability? Where does reliability even come from in a system? So Emily Freeman, the author of DevOps for Dummies, who works at AWS, who is incredibly smart, and you should go and watch all her stuff about this revolutionary software development model, kind of calls out that reliability is an outcome or a property that comes from everything you're doing with building a system. So that's operating, deploying, automating, developing, and architecting. Everything you do influences reliability. It can never really live only with one person. Even if you've got a site reliability engineering team, they don't do all these activities. They don't do, I think someone on chat, it already is being recorded. So if you're having some connection issues, you should be able to watch this back afterwards, if you can hear the fact that I'm saying that if you're having connection issues. Anyway, with this, there's all these different facets to building systems and reliable systems and everything else. You know, quality's kind of got to come from the base. It's got to be part of everything. You can't take a system that's been developed badly and operate it to the point where it becomes reliable. That doesn't really exist. That's not possible. So really, this is something that's holistic that you have to think of in the aggregate. The quickest way I've ever found for improving quality in the system, and I think this will always be the quickest way to improve quality in the system, especially in enterprises, is put the engineers on call. So make it so when the engineers build something, the nice little bugs that become gifts that wake people up at 2 o'clock in the morning, the engineers are the ones that have to wake up and deal with that, because all of a sudden they care a lot more about the quality of output that they're producing, because now they're on the hook for it. And when we went from old development and operations, ITIL style build and run, or however you want to look at it, we went to DevOps, and we kind of had you build it, you run it. And now SRE is kind of pulling us back a little bit from that to go, well, all of running it probably doesn't want to live with the delivery team, because we want them to be able to deliver more. So how do we kind of do this? We do want engineers on call. And what Google did back at the start was, in order for your system to be supported by site reliability engineering team, there was a quality bar that you had to hit, that the SRE team defined. One of the best things I read out of the SRE book back when I read it was that your SRE team will not accept any system that hasn't run in production for 6 months already, at least, and has a proven track record of being generally stable. And I think that's really interesting. So there is this pushback here. If you can hit a certain quality bar, then SRE can take over on call and take over operations. If you can't hit that quality bar, you will end up doing operations yourself until the quality goes up again. So there's this feedback and kind of tension here that I think is really critical. And it's a really critical thing to developers may not have to be on call, but they should know that if the quality drops, they will be on call. And it really does work to help kind of make the work a little bit better. When, again, one of the things that came out of the book at the start is the way Google scaled their SRE team, and when they kind of found the trigger point for we need more people, was when firefighting became more than 50% of what the team's doing on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis. You don't want to be firefighting all the time, because you end up in a position where you're not really moving forward, you're just moving still. If you're constantly firefighting, you can't make things better. All you can do is kind of just maintain where you are. And I put it here, firefighting is about handling today, and the engineering part of SRE is about making tomorrow better. If you look, it's the same thing developers kind of go on about a lot of the time with technical debt, that eventually with too much technical debt, you can't move forward. You have to keep paying that down. You have to keep investing in the system, in aspects of the system that users might not really care about, because they allow you to do the things that people care about tomorrow. Whether 50-50 is right for your organization, I cannot tell you, but you probably want to understand what this number looks like for you. It's not that it has to stay there forever, but understanding what percentage on either side you're happy to kind of take. Is it 50-50? Is it 30-70? Is it 80-20? But using this as a gauge of where you are and using this to go, okay, we need to expand the SRE team because we're starting to lose the ability to scale ourselves, to build better systems, to invest where we feel we need to invest because we're too busy fighting fires. So these are just kind of things when you're planning SRE or trying to look at how you're going to do it. These are kind of things you just need to be thinking about. And it's not that you're going to have the right answer on day one, but you need to have a answer on day one, and then you can refine and iterate that over time. Okay, managing risk. I'm going to go into complexity theory ever so slightly here, and I do apologize, but I do think it's very important for these kind of things. So every system that you build, every system, every team builds everywhere is a unique, complex, adaptive system. I'm not going to go hugely into what complex adaptive systems are, but effectively, the important word here is complex. That's the important word. When you have something that is complex, you can start using all this research into the concept of complexity theory. It's kind of a dull read. I don't think everyone should get heavily involved in it. I'm a kind of a weird person that enjoys it, but not everyone should. But kind of the cliff notes are that when something is complex, you can't just think your way through the problem. You won't be able to reason about it. You won't be able to think. No one is smart enough to be able to understand the system in its entirety in their head. And even if they are, that's not scalable. If you take that and now you go, okay, well, I can read all the code, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be able to understand how the system actually works. So you end up in this complex space up in the top left, where it says complex, emergent, practice, and probe, sense, respond. When you're building out the system and you're trying to make it reliable, there are patterns and approaches you can take from other people, but the reality is that making a system reliable is not so much engineering as it is learning. You need to learn about the system, learn how it operates, learn how it works, learn all the unexpected things that you won't be able to think it will do until it does it. I think anyone that's operated a system, any kind of scale, is used to this kind of thing. You make a small change that you think is fine, and the consequences are beyond what you could possibly think. In the old way of thinking in operations, where you had a software release every month, every quarter, something like that, the big focus was on MTBF, which is mean time between failures, over MTTR. The problem with focusing on MTBF, because MTBF sounds good, right? Like, oh, it hasn't broken for 3 months. That's great. The problem with that is when it only breaks every 3 months, chances are it's going to take a long time to recover because you don't know how it works. You haven't got the playbooks and you haven't got the experience, and the engineers haven't seen a lot of this before, and they're trying to remember how they debugged it last time, but it's been a long time. Really, you do want to be looking at mean time to recovery. How can we recover quicker? How can we get, and there's operational parts to this, doing rollbacks, doing blue-green deployments, feature flagging, you name it. There's all these different strategies for bringing MTTR down, and observability and chaos engineering, all these things are wonderful for this. Because every time the system breaks, every time you have a failure, what that really is an unplanned investment in its reliability, because you have an opportunity to learn now about the system, learn how it works, learn a bit more about it. And that's just really critical that you take it. Failures happen, but you want to take advantage of them. They are technically unplanned investments if you want to take a very optimistic view of it. Really, no system's 100% reliable. Failure is inevitable. But what you're trying to do to kind of twist the old Facebook adage is to move fast and don't break things. That's really what you want to be able to do. You want to be able to, all delivery teams want to be able to move quickly and things don't break, things don't get too bad. And I'll kind of go into that a little bit too bad in the next section. So that was kind of SRE as a whole. Now I'm going to talk about like a very kind of specific example of me helping implement SRE and start to adopt some of the practices at a really large enterprise in the UK. The name doesn't appear anywhere in it because I'm not allowed to say, but effectively this is based off some work I did last year, looking at how we can start to slow drip in SRE and kind of build some capability and knowledge and kind of build that groundswell to really get people excited about doing SRE and what that could mean for the business. So what I'm really going to talk about is product delivery through SLOs. So, and I'll go into what SLOs are and how they fit into SRE. I left it out of the start because I define them here. But this is using SRE concepts for building out something new. So starting not SRE as some bolt-on that after 6 months of running, we're going to SRE this system now, but looking at how SRE can influence how the enterprise builds products going forward, how they look at how they build reliable systems from day one, because that's a very much easier place to get started rather than the big system that everyone has spent, they've been building for 30 years and everything else, that a lot of people around, and there's a lot of politics and history and everything else. If you're wanting to get started in the business, it's generally easier to start with a greenfield and prove it out that way than go brownfield and have to attack something with a lot of history around it. So again, I've kind of got another set of key takeaways, but mainly from this second part. The first is that eliminating waste drives better outcomes. I will be talking a bit of lean theory here, but again, I think it's important for this, and I think it's important to see how SRE and lean theory work together and can work together. The second is that implicit expectations exist, and this is something as an SRE function, I think it is fundamental to understand. And the third is that SLOs, or service level objectives, as I'll get into them in a bit more detail, is one of the key things about them, one of the really valuable things about them, is they convert these implicit expectations into concrete outcomes. So rather than have people have things in people's heads that they don't talk about, fundamentally, you need to talk about things with people, and SLOs are a really fantastic way of doing that. So the example I'm going to talk about is about AWS landing zones. Now, I'm assuming the vast majority of people are familiar with AWS, the public cloud by Amazon. Landing zones are building out the scalable platform that people consume. So when you've got delivery teams trying to get onto AWS, how do you give them all the things they need to be able to start deploying their application today? It is very much that infrastructure style of SRE that I talked about before. And on the right, I've just got some of the things you would generally do as part of that, like AWS account vending, giving people access to accounts, putting security guardrails in so people can move quickly about it. And then, CI/CD pipelines, because it's 2022. We all use CI/CD today, I hope. I know not everyone, but please do. And one of the things that often I see in SRE, in talks about SRE and blogs about SRE and books and everything else, is often they're talking about doing SRE for super high throughput systems. So, like Google did it because their APIs get millions of requests a minute, probably nowadays, I don't know, something stupid, right? And I fundamentally believe that SRE is for all systems. It's not just for these high throughput systems. And when I get into the numbers, you'll see that a landing zone is not a high throughput system. It's a critical system, but it's not super high throughput. But I still think SRE and SLOs have a lot of validity here in how you approach things. I'm specifically going to narrow in on account vending, because for me, it's one of the core things that landing zone does. It's fundamental. You can't have a landing zone without account vending. It does not. That's not a thing. So when you're doing account vending or you're building out a platform, everyone's probably familiar with user stories. As a development team, I want to build a provision AWS account so I can deploy my application. You know, simple enough user story. I'm sure we've all seen things of this formal function. There, you know, there's almost an infinite number in existence. It's generally how things start. And I'm not against user stories. I quite like them. I don't think they're enough for you to start work. And this is where SRE and SLO can actually have a big influence on this. So again, I'm a bit of a lean theorist, lean junkie. I really like lean as a way of looking at the world and looking at waste and stuff like that. At a very high level, a very quick 10-second introduction to lean. I know I'm supposed to talk about SRE, but all these things are interlinked. That lean says that there are different kinds of waste when you're trying to do something. There are 8 different kinds of waste in a process. And removing those kinds of waste means you do more valuable work instead. These are the 8 kinds of waste. I'm not going to touch on all of them today. I'm only going to touch on one. These all have validity in a software setting. You can go and read some books. There's a lot of really great ones by Tom and Mary Popendick from the early 2000s on this. They're fantastic. Go and read those if you want to dive into this a lot more detail. But effectively, what I'm going to focus on today is the concept of extra processing. So that's building something that's too high a quality. You know, spending 3 months engineering something when really you could have spent 2 weeks and got something out the door that would be good enough for now because there's other things to be working on. And I think SLOs and SRE has a really interesting place for detecting and removing this kind of waste. So come back to this user story. There is a near infinite number of ways I can do this. I can click buttons in the AWS console to get this. I can fully automate it so it goes really, really quick. I mean, there's a million things in between those two things. There's a fundamental question that a user story really doesn't help you answer. And that's, what is good enough? If we're building out this part of a product, and you know, this doesn't have to be a line zone, this can be any product, what's good enough? How quick does it need to be? How much does it need to work? How much failure are we allowed to have? You know, all these kinds of questions. And the user story really doesn't tell you anything to that effect. And before we answer kind of what is good enough, we need to define, like, who defines good enough? Who gets to say that the feature that we've built is good enough for production, that we can stop work, that we can move on to the next thing? Really, this comes back to the concept of product management. And product management is tension management. Really, product management is taking a bunch of trying to manage a bunch of different tension points. You've got the tension between the product owner and the delivery team. You've got the tension between the delivery team and the SRE team. You've got the tension between the product owner and the customers, the product owner and their direct stakeholder. Effectively, the product manager is trying to keep everyone as happy as possible within the constraints that they're working under by defining what tasks get worked on and what the priority is and working with the engineers to do that, right? I'm going to talk about one particular kind of tension, and that's between delivery and consumers. So really in delivery, what you want to do is build the easiest, simplest, cheapest thing that you can that will keep your customers happy. That's fundamentally, that's like the most efficient way to keep them happy and everything else. That's what you're trying to do, is to give them the best experience you can for the least effort that you can at the same time. And really, this is something that SRE actually really helps us with. So for people who haven't come across SLOs, SLIs, and SLAs before, these are some very quick definitions. So an SLI, or service level indicator, defines the success and failure of something. The service level objective defines how frequently am I allowed to fail within a certain time parameter, like how many API requests can fail every hour, every day, every month. Depends on where you set your sliding window as to how you're looking at that. And the service level agreement defines the penalty if you exceed your failure goal. So if you fail more than you said you would, then there's some contractual obligation there. For internal systems, you're not going to have an SLA. It doesn't make much sense to have contracts between parts of the same company. If you've got an external API that your people are paying for, generally you'll have some kind of SLA there. If you look at AWS, GCP, Azure, Stripe, any GitHub, any SaaS provider or any cloud provider or anything will have SLAs around certain things. So it'll be like, the EC2s and AWS will be available, I think it's 99.99% of the time. So they're allowed to have EC2s be unavailable for a certain period of time every month. And if they don't, then they give you service credits back. And that's part of using any cloud provider. They all have similar things. One of the fundamental things with this is you can't have an SLA without an SLO, and you can't have an SLO without an SLI. You need to understand what constitutes success and failure and how much failure you're allowed before you can start to slap contracts on everything, right? A really common thing I see with enterprises saying they're doing SRE is they will have an SLA. There's no SLO, there's no SLI, there's no calculation behind it. It exists on a Confluence page or a wiki page, SharePoint, something like that. And there's a document somewhere that says SLAs. And I always go, what is this? Like, where are you measuring against this? What have you been historically tracking against this? Like, what are you doing? And I've kind of coined a term fairly recently called Schrödinger's SLAs for anyone that's familiar with the superpositional quantum mechanic thought experiment from Schrödinger. Can I elaborate about chaos engineering? Sorry. Yeah, I'll do that in the Q&A at the end. More than happy to talk about chaos engineering as well as part of this. So Schrödinger's SLA, when you have an SLA that's not calculable, that no one can actually look at or anything else, then it's not really worth anything. You're both failing and succeeding against the SLA at one point in time. It really doesn't mean anything at all. And I'll talk to in a minute about how you can actually make sure that you're not doing Schrödinger's SLAs. And I'll link to a little GitHub open source project that I've got that has an example of how you can do this as well. So jumping back to the user story, I'll put some numbers in here. If you're unfamiliar with the domain of AWS platforms and stuff like that, hopefully you'll still be able to follow the numbers along with this. So I've kind of talked about we want SLIs and we want SLOs for things. So we have a user story. We need to define what the SLI is. What constitutes success and failure for vending an account. So if you go to like a customer, a client within the business, they'll go, oh, I want an account within 5 minutes. Now, if you haven't worked in this domain, I'll tell you that this is silly. This is not really possible. The engineering required to do this is super, super high. The strain on the team to be able to do this, also very high. This is not really something that's feasible. So naturally, this is where the tension comes in. You kind of come back with something else. You'll go, well, how about a week? This is very easy to do. Like you can just have someone that goes through all the requests and does it every Friday, right? Like you don't have to even automate any of this. You can really change the way you want to do this. It gives you a lot of options because there may be other things you want to do. But asking teams to wait a week for an account is actually quite a lot. If you've got new teams standing up all the time, trying to get going, and what happens when you get like 500 account requests or something ridiculous? Like what do you do here? This, doesn't really work. The idea is eventually you'll end up at some kind of middle ground, some compromise in between the two positions, between 5 minutes and 5 days. And this is one that, I've used at clients. Everyone generally seems pretty happy with it. A day is sufficient. If you can't know you need an AWS account ahead, like a day ahead of time, then you've got other problems. Like the problem's not the platform's not working fast enough for you. It's you need to actually sit down and think about things a little bit more. For reference, this is 100 times slower than the initial request and 5 times quicker than the counter. So, we've ended up with something in the middle here, which is actually workable, which is fantastic. So when you're going through and defining SLIs and SLOs and all that kind of stuff, I always come back to SMART goals, generally used more for career development and all those kind of things. If you're writing, working at most companies and you're writing out like what are your plans for the quarter, the half, the year, whatever that is, they always say, oh, do a SMART goal and stuff like that. So when we're talking through the SLI, what an SLI gives us is actually 4 of the 5. It's something specific, an account vended, it's measurable, yeah, we can measure that. It's relevant, well, yeah, it's relevant, and time boxed, and we've got that day time box to it. So we've hit 4 out of 5 on here. Where the SLO comes in is this point about attainability. I've already said systems fail. You're never going to get an account out within the business say 100% of the time. You shouldn't aim to get it out 100% of the time. What you want to do is figure out this point in between where like, well, how often do we think is reasonable? That still gives us room to choose about things and take risks and prioritize other things, but something that will still keep the business generally happy and allows them to understand what they're actually getting from the service. So another anti-pattern that I see very commonly is, again, because people learn SRE and they look at how Google does it and how Amazon does it and all that kind of stuff. They get very what I call 9 happy, and they love going, oh, it's 2 9s, it's 3 9s, it's 4 9s, whatever. And it's like 99% of the time it will work, or 99.9% of the time it'll work. So if we kind of take that and go, oh, if it's 2 9s, but just 99%, what does that really mean? But say we want to, I think we probably want to allow 2 accounts to kind of go over the time, to take more than a day every month. Really, that means that you're doing 200 accounts a month consistently. If you still want to be able to hit a 99% SLO with 2 failures, there is not a business on the earth that does 200 accounts a month consistently. It does not exist. Again, you'll have to take my word on that because I've worked in this domain for an extended period of time. But this is just ludicrous. It's not reasonable. What is reasonable, 10 accounts a month for an enterprise feels about right. You'll have some months more, some lower, and you can always adjust this again after that. But really your SLO should be based on what you're predicting, what you think about reality, what you think is going to happen. So if you want to have the idea that you can have a couple of accounts take a little bit longer, and then you think you're going to have 10 accounts a month, your SLO is actually 80%, not a 9 in sight. But that's not a problem. You want these to be based on your best thinking at the time, not they look like someone else's. That's not really not a goal with this. So now we've ended up with an SLO for this. Account vending happens within 1 business day, 80% of the time over a rolling 30-day window. Awesome. This is something we can calculate. And again, the open source project, that link at the end, it's very small. It was just a proof of concept, kind of allows you to track this over time. So if you're building out this platform, you want to understand what's our SLO for account vends, it has some boilerplate code you can use to do that effectively. What the reality is, when you look at these systems, is every 9 you want to add. So if you want to go from 99% uptime to 99.9 or 99.9 to 99.99, it's about 10 times the cost as the one before. It's exponential, not linear. So as you're trying to make systems really reliable, it gets a lot harder and requires a lot more investment to be able to get there. It's not simple. It's not as simple as we put it on Kubernetes, so all of a sudden we're at 5 9s. No, it doesn't work like that. It gets a lot harder to do, because when you actually look at the time, you go from like hours of downtime to minutes to seconds. It is just fundamentally a different ball game to try and build a system that's 5 9s. And really, a lot of internal systems, especially even external systems, they don't need to be 5 9s. When you look at it, team capacity is limited, and this goes for SRE teams, this goes for delivery teams, this goes for everyone. Every team has a capacity limit, and you do not want to hit 100% utilization on a team. That's a whole other topic and a whole other talk, but effectively you want to leave slack in a team. If you take this as team capacity is limited And the higher reliability you try and go, the harder it gets. You end up at a conclusion that less is more. As a delivery team, as an SRE team, what you actually want is the minimal reliability standards. You want kind of the lowest possible that you can negotiate. The customer's always going to try and pull reliability up. It's your job to pull reliability down. Otherwise, if you just go to where customers want you to be, you're going to be in a really bad position. That's kind of why I took that 5-minute example, because customers want what they want. They don't really care about how hard it is. They just want it. So it's up to you to kind of manage capacity and have those conversations and really drive back with your customers about what you're going to do and how you're going to go forward, right? Fundamentally, like if you're looking at building out a product or anything else, and this is where I think SRE and SLO really impacts, one of the reasons it impacts product development so much is if you give an engineer the user story on the left, you give it to 10 engineers, you'll end up with 10 wildly different things. All work different, all have different properties, they work very differently. If you give them the thing on the right, you can measure that it does perform to kind of that expectation, and all of a sudden it doesn't matter so much how they've done it internally all that much, but you know what you're getting. You've got a lot more concreteness, a lot more valid expectation of what you're going to get out of the engineers or members on the SRE team or whatever it is. And really, when it comes down to it, clarity and transparency are wonderful things because they help you move quicker and they help people understand what's going on, and a much healthier level of communication. There's all these benefits. The screen is split again. I hate. There is that slide was as part of 2, so I'll just share again. Okay, if I just jump forward a slide quickly. Hopefully that's fine now. I do apologize for all the slide problems. It is not normally this bad. This is particularly bad. So I talked about Schrödinger's SLOs before. So stopping having these, just putting, having the SLO in a Jira ticket somewhere doesn't really mean anything either, right? You can build to these things, but you need to be able to measure these things. And if you look at SRE teams, if you look at observability or chaos, like all these kind of things, measurement is king. You need to be able to measure things, you need to look at things, you need to be able to understand things. So how do you get away from Schrödinger's SLAs? Now, I will caveat this with, you cannot debug a system with a dashboard, but SLOs don't help you debug a system. SLOs help you understand that the system is broken. They do not help you actually figure out how it's broken, just that it's broken. And those are fundamentally different things. And it's a really important concept to also get, that an SLO will tell you how badly you're broken, what the impact of the break is. It won't tell you potentially where the break is or what caused the break or anything else. There's different metrics for each one. So an SLO should never be something like the CPU stays under 80%. That doesn't mean anything. If you see that in an SLO or something, that's just nonsense. Because SLOs are measured from the customer out. So a customer doesn't care that what percentage the CPU is at, they care that the API responses happen on time and they're quick and they're correct and all that kind of stuff. So what you want to do is, one of the things you can do to get away from these Schrödinger's SLAs is build a dashboard, get the measurement in, get the measurements in looking from the user perspective. So in here, account vending, access provisioning, compliance scans, on-premise connectivity, all these things, if you're building out a platform, if you're like infrastructure, SRE team, all things you're going to care about, and you're measuring them from the customer point of view and making sure that based on the SLOs you defined with your customers as you've gone out of there, that you're measuring relative to those. And where this gets into is things like this account vending when you blow it out. So the difference between where you are and your SLO is your error budget. So that's how much you're allowed to break before anyone can realistically get quite annoyed at you, because you've told them the system is 80% reliable and you've been overperforming. So now you have some room. So if you want to do a big refactor, or you want to add new features, or you just want to leave this alone, this helps you decide that you're going to do that, right? Because you're like, oh, well, we're massively overperforming our SLO, account vending is going amazing, everyone's happy, cool. We can now stop working on it, or we can go and add some risky new feature or something like that. Like, we have options here because we understand how things are going. Again, another common anti-pattern that I see, and something that's counterintuitive, is you want to be aware of inflating expectations. So if you have a system that is massively overperforming, say back on that example with the account vending, if your account vending operates 95% for 6 to 12 months, it doesn't matter that you said the SLO was 80%, people are now going to think it's 95%. People, humans like to see patterns in everything. And if people get too accustomed to systems being more operable than they're supposed to be, that's actually a bad thing. Because you have spent this time dragging the SLO down, giving yourself a buffer, and they've gone and taken that buffer away. So now all of a sudden when the system breaks, they'll come complain, but it's like, but it's still 90%. And they're like, but it's not, it should be 95. So really, you actually want to pseudo intentionally break the system every so often to remind people that the system can break and that they need to be aware and plan and expect that. So there's a bit of a weird counterintuitive point, but if you're building a system and it's too reliable, it's probably worth breaking it. Just remind people that it will happen, because eventually it will happen. And again, someone already asked about chaos engineering, kind of getting there a little bit in terms of that as well. That's kind of a similar mindset to this. So if we have a look at another example of access provisioning, so we've only got a 2% error budget here. We don't have a lot of room to play. We probably shouldn't do anything risky with this right now, because then we'll go under our SLO. And at that point, you start to erode trust with other teams, and you end up with kind of other problems. So in this scenario, probably don't want to throw new features at it. Probably we'll want to look at building at the budget, maybe paying down some tech debt, assigning some people to look at it and fix some issues. If there's pending bug fixes on this, maybe that getting those prioritized is the right thing to do in this situation. You can end up in positions like this where you are massively underperforming. This might be that you built something and it broke because people put change in that it broke, and then you prioritized other things that dropped way below. The other way you can end up in this situation is you're building out this for the first time. So say you're building out this compliance framework that's looking at things or something. As you're building it out, you should see that 63 number go on as you do the rollout and everything else. You take it to production, you should see it get up. And once it's up at like 98% or something, there's probably a call about whether to bother going to 100 or not. Depends on how much effort it is to take it out to 100 and scale it the whole way out, or fix some bugs or edge cases that you found, because you've said that it's only going to work 95% of the time anyway. So this is where the whole point of stopping extra processing comes back. If in this case, you can know how good it is, and you've gone, okay, it's actually performing up to the standard, up to the expectation we've set, and it's slightly overperforming. There's now a question about what to do next. Do you continue to invest in it, or do you probably move on to other things? Chances are you're probably going to move on to other things. But this is where that kind of point comes through, that having these SLOs allow you to see that, visually see the fact that you've built something and it's now good enough. Cool, let's move on to the next thing. Because again, team capacity is limited. You can only do so many things. If you build everything up to being an amazing feat of engineering, you're only going to be able to do a few things. I always say, please don't read this slide. Please don't read this slide. It's more for reference at the end. If you grab the slides after. I put a bunch of example SLOs in here, SLIs and SLOs in for a variety of capabilities that a platform team would probably provide, or an SRA team would provide, building an AGOS landing zone. If you understand the domain and you read this and you thought about your organization, you would probably argue with me on the definition of some of these, on the SLO of some of these. Fantastic. That's exactly the point. When I say that having SLOs turn implicit expectations into concrete outcomes, that's the point. Whenever you, and it was even in the bit before I was talking about the tension and the debate going back and forth and trying to find where the happy medium was. Like, this is kind of the point, is putting it down on paper and going, this is how the system's going to work, and this is how we're going to measure our success, starts to have some really positive conversations with your customers, with the people who are using your system, as to whether that's fit for purpose for them or not. If you don't have these conversations, they will have certain expectations, or they will expect things, or you won't be able to understand what it is they really want. So this is where this is super powerful for bringing this SRE focus out through to SLOs. You end up with a highly operable system that is measured from customer outcomes from day one, that is designed very much with the customer in mind, and is measured to that effect from the start. There is this little open source project I've alluded to a couple of times that does some, works with Terraform, sends some events, allows you to graph them. I was going to live demo, but I've run, depending on timing, but I've run out of time. But there is a video recording of the live demo in the repo anyway, so you can go and look. So the key takeaways from part 2, again, just to go back over them: eliminating waste drives better outcomes. So if you use SRE and SLOs to help you gold plating features, then you can build more features and do more and provide more business impact than building an amazing feat of technical engineering that does one thing amazingly well when the business doesn't need it to do it that well. The second is that implicit expectations exist. Everyone has an opinion on pretty much everything. That's, almost the state of humanity. You want to be able to understand what people expect out of things. You want to be able to take those expectations and turn them into how you deliver your products and how you do SRE. And the third is SLOs are the best way I've found for converting those expectations. So the dashboard you build out or whatever, when I've done it at companies before, we make that dashboard available to everyone in the business who wants to have a look. This isn't some internal thing. This is about being transparent so people can see, how's the team performing? Is the platform performing as expected? They can never say they weren't told or anything else, or they didn't know, because we tell them, hey, look, it's here. Go have a look if you want. It's fully, you can go and read everything, you can see everything. We want to be transparent with you in the hope that you'll be transparent with us. And this is with SRE and all that kind of stuff, being able to show metricize and show how things are going and everything else, and show how you're delivering value to the business and everything else is just critical when growing out SRE or any other kind of team. And then we'll just end before jumping into Q&A on the part 1 kind of key takeaways. Again, that SRE is not one size fits all. There's a bunch of different teams. The example I picked was the infrastructure mode of operation for SRE. There are others. They are all valid depending on your context. Just because I listed 6 doesn't mean there aren't 7 or 8. Those are just the 6 that seem canonically defined at the moment. But again, emerging practice, always finding more. Again, SRE is fundamentally different to traditional operations. If you're coming from an operations background, I think SRE is probably a wonderful place to step into. Just understand that it is different. If you jump into an SRE team and it doesn't feel any different, it's probably not SRE. Change is painful, doesn't matter what kind of change you're trying to do. If it feels all too comfortable, chances are nothing's really changing. And the third is failure is inevitable, and that's okay. Like my slides failing 6 times through this presentation, hopefully you all thought that was still okay. But yeah, systems fail. It's actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing, because that allows you to learn.